So I'm not going to waste your time with a long intro because I think from the title and thumbnail it's pretty obvious what this video is. The only two things I will say is firstly, when I say every character, I obviously don't mean things like Sai's manager, Team W's goalkeeper, or the U20 match referee. But every reasonable character should be in here. Secondly, do expect manga spoilers throughout, and also some other channels that you might recognize. Kira was a huge part of why Blue Lock's first episode is one of the best out there. I fully expected him on first introduction to be the rival that the main character takes down at the end of the series, but instead we get an absolutely crazy ending to our first episode. The way this horridly arrogant side of him explodes in entitlement and disbelief after being eliminated sets up the series perfectly. However, regarding the Kira comes back theory, the thing is, if he was going to come back, I feel like the perfect time for it has already been, as a starting player for Ubers, for instance. Now, him returning would have been kind of interesting to see what he's like, but not only do we already have so many characters already, I also think Kunigami fills that role of kind guy gone bad. So having two of them would be kind of redundant, and we basically get just as much from seeing his reaction to Blue Lock winning as we would from him fully coming back. Bachira's whimsy is honestly always really refreshing to see, and in spite of his very carefree nature, he's actually often the most level-headed player on the pitch, unaffected by the pressure of being behind in a match or the intimidation of being against a strong opponent. The prime example being in the match against Team V, where every single member of Team Z gave up, except him. I think my favourite thing about him though is he says things which are so obvious and true, yet so easily forgotten, which makes him feel very wise in his own unique way. In the Team V match, reminding everyone that there's no point despairing during the game, or in 154 when he tells Isagi not to stress too much over their decision, as if they're going to be the best in the world, they should be able to reach the top wherever they go. To see him go from having some major codependency issues to now just going where his gut takes him, and having the confidence that it'll all work out, has been beautiful to see. I think my opinion on Gagamaru is the same as basically everyone else. Before he became a goalkeeper, he was a pretty cool character, but I never really thought twice about him. But ever since he changed positions, every single time this guy does something, it's just so hype. You know, I just find myself grinning whenever he makes a save. It's pretty funny that just on account of natural reflexes he's managed to take the starting spot of Monkun's goalkeeper, who's likely spent his entire life training to get as good as he is. It just always felt a little unrealistic to me, but I found myself just not caring whatsoever, because he's just such a joy to watch. I don't think there's much to say in terms of like deeper analysis for this guy, but I do like that he just saw being switched to a goalkeeper as, oh cool, I'll be a goalkeeper instead. It seems like he's having a blast doing it, and it's probably going to go way further there than he ever would have as a striker. And speaking of goalkeepers, we've got to mention Lemon. This guy deserves so much more, man. In addition to preparing all these presentations, there's these little notes throughout the chapters that showed that this guy really gave 120% for the good of Team Z. And I have to wonder, looking back, why Blue Lockman wasn't used for the first selection. I suppose it was just a numbers thing, but it seems kind of odd that in a facility designed to create the best striker in the world, 25 players had to play in goal for the first selection. And, you know, he had a couple cool moments like his save against Rio's free kick, but I do still feel kinda sorry for him. Obviously he lost somewhere in the second selection, but I imagine there's quite a few players that only got through that because of the awakenings they had in the first selection, which obviously he missed out on. And that leads me quite nicely into Kuon, who of course only really played 2 proper games in the first selection, and as such, unsurprisingly, didn't make it through the second. The story has a pattern of punishing those who rely on something other than their own skill. For example, Team X who just relied on Barou and were all eliminated as a result. I think Kuon really added a lot to the first selection. His slimy betrayal really adding to the brutal cutthroat feeling of the first selection, and Jinpachi's reprimanding of him, reminding us and the players that whilst this is a battle for survival, those who just try and survive won't. The real irony of his betrayal though is that he previously felt betrayed by his former teammates for not taking it seriously and not aiming high enough. Yet when he got exactly that, he was the one intimidated by the stronger teams, and he was the one who just gave up on beating them. Despite his redeeming sacrifice, I was very glad to see him eliminated, but I still think he played a brilliant role in Season 1. Chigiri is another incredibly cool character, and the one who still holds my favourite goal in the series. To me, it was a guy who'd almost completely given up, but due to that tiny little spark inside him, couldn't bring himself to end his football career on his own, instead relying on Blue Lock's clause of the winners can't represent Japan, and allowing things to play out so that he wouldn't have to think too much about it all, so he would be forced to quit. Seeing him throw aside the supposed piece of quitting to give himself one last shot, pun fully intended, gets me every time. I can't help but find myself always rooting for him, and he seems to be Manshine's MVP at the moment, managing to steal a goal even against PXG. His formula of getting to this very small little zone using his speed is pretty cool, but I do expect he'll have to change things up at some point as teams realise what's going on. Now, Raichi is another character people don't like, and maybe I just have a thing of liking the characters everyone else seems to hate, because I've always really liked Raichi, and I can't put my finger on exactly why. You know, up until the Ubers match, he never had anything particularly interesting going on. He was often very rude to the other members of Team Z, and whilst he did make some good defensive plays in the first selection, he always felt like he was a lot more talk than he was ever able to back up. However, seeing him hold his own against Snuffy in the Ubers match was one of the coolest things in the series to me. I think the writer is extremely good at giving characters like Raichi and Ikiguri moments which feel very realistic, yet still allow these underdogs to fight some real giants. He currently sits at 23rd, and I think he's extremely likely to survive. He's really found his calling as this annoying, stubborn defensive player. Moving on to the greatest character of all, Ikiguri. Now, I recently posted a 22-minute video on him, so I think I said all that can be said about him in that already, but basically he is to me someone doing everything he can to fulfill Jinpachi's ideals, but without the talent to really do so. In Chapter 8, Jinpachi told Team Z to take up arms, find their own unique weapon, make fools of their enemies, and above all, the beings known as first-class strikers all have their own original weapons that no one else has. Now, who does that sound like? I really doubt Ikiguri likes his weapon being what it is, but he just doesn't have what everyone else does. And that persistence to find something he could actually use really paid off for him. If he tried to emulate anyone else's weapons, there's no way No would have ever subbed him in, as he'd just be inferior at them to someone else. I pray this man gets an offer.
Kunigami Rensuke started as a main character and fan favorite in Blue Lock, but his transformation into a cold, serious fallen hero has left many, including myself, questioning his development. As the only player to return via the wild card after being eliminated, his reappearance into the NEL arc generated immense hype. While he had an impressive start and some character focus early on, his potential has been sidelined in recent chapters, leaving me wondering why was he even brought back? Reintroduced as the perfect striker without weaknesses, he has yet to live up to that title, scoring only through assists from Isagi and even playing as a defender in the game against PXG, a puzzling choice. Whatever happens in this final game, a proper flashback or exposition about his wildcard experience would give some much needed context and depth to his character. If he could experience some kind of awakening, regaining his heroic persona and overcoming the trauma he endured, it would mark an exciting shift. I still hope that Kunigami will play a significant role in Blue Lock. After all, why reintroduce him otherwise?
Naruhaya is a really sad character to look back on, now that we know what happens on the NEL. If he'd just survived this selection, then he would have had a shot of getting himself into a professional team and providing for his family as a result. I'm really hoping that one day we are going to see the reactions of some of the eliminated players to the U20 match and the NEL, but it's going to be really heartbreaking if we see his. He's again one of the many characters that the story very ruthlessly punishes for relying on something except their own skill. In his case, he didn't seem to have enough courage in his own capabilities. I do think he was a little too harsh on himself for his inability to make that final shot though, as it just wasn't something he could, suddenly learn in the middle of a match. And he hit the post as well. It's not like he was miles off. But yeah, definitely one of the sadder eliminations that we've had so far. Isagi is undoubtedly the player who has improved the most since arriving at Blue Lock. And of course, that's the case in the vast majority of series. But Blue Lock makes it all feel extremely convincing due to Isagi's weapons mostly being his brain and eyes. Combined with the fact that he's only started using them properly since coming to Blue Lock, it makes sense that a mental and new weapon would grow a lot faster than most. Chigiri's speed, Kunigami's strength, as well as just about anyone else's technique, has been worked on for a long time, and hence should grow slower as a result. Besides that, Isagi's mindset is what makes Blue Lock so inspiring for me. He's never once seen making excuses, he just looks at his shortcomings as things to overcome instead. He's fully willing to learn from anyone and everyone around him, and whilst we do see him getting frustrated at times, he quickly moves past it and returns to focus on how he's going to win again. Also, him calling out Noah and Loki in 284 is one of the craziest things I've ever seen. Okay, last and absolutely least from Team Z, Yudai Imamura. I don't know how I'm going to talk about this guy for a minute. He doesn't even have a minute of screen time. If you don't remember who he is, I wouldn't blame you. I think he has one moment where he just talks about football being like love and Team Y is a girl that's out of his league before missing a shot on that set. People hate on Igaguri a lot for supposedly being useless, but he actually makes some blocks in a couple passes. This guy, I can't recall anything else besides that missed shot. And so it's no surprise that with seemingly no actual skill or ability to impact the game, he just doesn't make it past the second selection. This probably hasn't been a minute yet, so I'm just going to have to kind of slowly say the sentence because there's just nothing else that I can say about this guy. So I think the only logical character that I can talk about next is Hajime Nishioka. Again, you might not recognize the name, but it's the Aomori's messy guy, hyped up when Kira and Isagi first walk into Blue Lock. Pretty much the only other time he's mentioned is after Barou and Naruhaya lose their 3v3 match. Despite Barou scoring all 4 goals, he was chosen ahead of Barou, which would seem to imply he's a better player than him, although we can't be certain as Barou has some personality problems, and they might have just thought he was a better fit for their team. But regardless, this guy has to be incredibly skilled, and it seems bizarre that he was taken out of the series due to an injury.
I've actually just had to re-record this guy's part, because I didn't realise that he had a 3 million offer. So he's evidently played in Manshine's latest game, but not done very well. 3 million is the same as what Nanase got after his first game. It's going to take a lot for him to make the top 23 now, but I mean, it would be bizarre if we never saw him again.
Barou is a brilliant character. On first impression, he just seems like an arrogant meathead, but I'm amazed by how much there is to discuss about him. If we go back to season 1, his initial mindset honestly really sucked, but it's something I saw in myself at the time. Believing himself entitled due to his years of hard work and natural talent, he refused to change his approach as a result. Obviously the complete opposite of Isagi. And of course, up until coming to Blue Lock, the gap between him and his peers was so fast that he was able to get away with it. Following this match, he still sees himself as the Tyrant King, but is far more aware that his throne isn't out of the reach of others. We even see him actually willing to learn and speak to some of his peers about the way that they play. Barou has always possessed everything Jinpachi was after, and throughout the series via characters like Snuffy, has learned all the little caveats to his philosophy that has now turned him into one of the best strikers out there. Also on the Ubers team is Nikko, who to me has always been Isagi but one step back. For instance, Isagi realised in his second game in the first selection that he has to play for his own goals. For Nikko, it was his third. Nikko's meta vision is always a step behind Isagi's, and even his trash talking feels like it's a step behind the straight hands Isagi throws out later. I like the direction they've taken him in the U20 match with him being this more defensive analytical player, even if it does kind of go against his whole thing after the first selection of I'm playing for my own goals now. I feel like it really suits him. You know, he's got a lot of similarities to Isagi.
He learns everything and anything he can from those around him. He's always looking for a way to boost himself further. It feels like the difference between the two is just Isagi has more drive, more fire in him, which is why Nikko's always trailing behind.
Have you ever asked yourself, why does Jyubei Aryu exist? If I describe the vibe of the first match in the second selection in one word, it'd be unfair. Isagi's team appears to be doing everything right, and yet they're brutally shut down by Rin's immeasurably superior abilities. That impression then is heightened by Blue Lock's number 2, Jyubei Aryu. Aryu distinguishes himself by his abnormally long limbs, an unfair, virtually illegal advantage that Isagi could never possibly overcome. And Aryu? He glamorously flaunts his superior body in their faces. In other words, Aryu is used to highlight what Isagi could never be. And that happens the exact same way in the third selection as well. This time, it's Reo who finds himself dwarfed by a horde of vastly superior players. And again, he's paired off against Aryu. Or even worse, now he's confronted with 2 Aryus. Talk about unfair here.
Otoya is the only member of Barca inside the top 23, besides Bachira. But I'm going to talk more about that when I come back to Lavinio. Like Bachira, he got on Barca's starting lineup from game 1. And if we go back to the third selection, he was introduced as being the descendant of ninjas with ninja-like abilities, which is just hilarious to me. He played as a right back for Blue Lock against Japan's U20 team, but I must confess, I just don't really recall him doing anything major. I know he created some chances, but I feel like he's just kind of faded into the background a bit and doesn't remotely feel like the number 4 he once was. It's a similar thing in the Barca match. I had a quick look through, and pretty much the only thing I could see him doing was this one pass to Bachira and a goal off screen against PXG, but he actually sits in 10th right now, so I guess he's actually doing quite a lot that we're just not shown on screen, which is fine, you know, he is a ninja after all. Now, Nagi is seriously struggling. He just doesn't seem to have a solid reason to play football besides escaping boredom or going along with Ryo's let's become the best in the world thing. He started off with zero interest in the sport before finally finding a challenge in his match against Team Z that caused him to find something more interesting to him than video games for the first time. And he was at least playing with some degree of intensity from there on out, and obviously against the U20 and Munken, pulled off 2 absurd goals. But outside of when he became focused on beating Isagi, he just hasn't really done anything. I think there's some truth to what Barou says in 245, that he needs to hit rock bottom to stand a chance on the world stage. But the issue with that is, I honestly don't think he cares enough for anything to feel like rock bottom to him. But it seems like Ryo has something planned for the next game, so we'll see. Speaking of which, Ryo has always felt like a player that should be having a lot more impact on the games than he is. Remember, this guy got into Blue Lock in just 6 months, meaning he should be growing faster than everyone else. We saw him using Metavision at the end of the Munken match, and his chameleon ability to cop players like Sai and Rin should make him one of the scariest players out there. A player who can dribble like Sai, control the ball like Nagi, and shoot like Rin on top of just about anything else he wants, even if not at 100%, is an absurd combination. His obsession with Nagi seems to be hampering his growth, with the pair of them being the only players to drop in rankings. And I hope it ends soon, because if he used his skill set properly, there's honestly no reason he shouldn't be making the starting lineup. Hiiragi is a character that you might not recognize if you haven't read episode Nagi. He's not really done anything in the main story. A 5 million offer popped up for him between the second and third round of offers, which I believe means he played in the PXG vs Manshine match where Rin scored a hat-trick. He actually has a super interesting combination of abilities, having a combination of Nagi's ball control and Isagi's foresight, which should on paper make him a complete monster, as Nagi lacks Isagi's deep understanding of the game, and Isagi lacks Nagi's insane skill with the ball. Someone who's not bound by either weakness should be a very scary player. However, unlike Isagi, who constantly updates his view of everyone consistently throughout the match, Hiiragi's predictions are just based on big data. It seems like it's just based on players past alone, and as such, is quickly overtaken by the rate everyone evolves at in Blue Lock. And so unless he pulls off something crazy in this last match, his 9 million offer won't save him, and I'm expecting him to be eliminated personally. Now, I'm putting both Wanima Twins together because, like, what is there to say about them as individuals? But one thing I do think is often overlooked though, is that the surviving Wanima twin, Junichi Wanima, scored 7 goals in the first selection. I'm not sure how many the other twins scored, but the two of them were clearly pretty solid players together, and I do wonder how well they would have done if they had both made it through together, because I guess they kind of did the whole clashing and crossing visions thing that Hiyori and Isagi did, except instead of not looking at each other, they only look at each other, and also just at a much lower level. Rather than the best plays they could imagine, it was just plays they could do. But yeah, that's the Wanima twins, I guess. Junichi sits at 8.2 million and 30th, and again, I don't expect this guy to get through this selection, honestly. Someone's gotta go, and this guy's gonna be one of them.
Itoshi Rin was introduced to us at the start of Blue Lock as the current #1 in the facility and the little brother of Itoshi Sai. Fast forward to the latest arcs and chapters of the series, and he's still the #1 player, which just shows you how skilled he is. Having insane shooting skills, spatial awareness, and even his own unique weapon, Destroyer Mode. A weapon that's so powerful, it brings out the opponent's best weapon and focuses on a play that crushes it. The two main rivals for Rin is of course Isagi and his brother Itoshi Sai. In Isagi's case, the Daniel and Cooler Daniel meme is a perfect way to describe Rin and Isagi, pretty much being an upgraded version of him in almost every way, especially when he was first introduced. His character honestly acts like a big obstacle for Isagi to surpass, leading to our main character's evolution and vice versa, both of them using each other to evolve. But his relationship and rivalry with his brother Itoshi Sai is his biggest driving factor for playing football in the first place, wanting to surpass him, especially because Sai crushed their shared dream. Rin will always be one of Blue Lock's best players, and I think towards the end of the manga, he'll be a big contender for the #1 spot.
Zantetsu's speed coming from his choice to run instead of taking the train, because he didn't understand affairs, might honestly be the funniest backstory of all time. But to me, he is one of many victims of this PXG vs Monken game, where established characters have just kind of faded into the background a bit. You know, I was never expecting him to score a goal or anything like that, and, you know, obviously it's fine for side characters to just be side characters. But maybe it's just where this game's gone on for a year now, but I don't recall him doing anything, to be honest. And you know, his acceleration and shooting are both incredibly potent. His initial burst is higher than everyone except Loki, by the looks of it, so we know he's a pretty solid player. But I think for this game specifically, there are just so many characters all set up for a moment that he's just not going to get one. Which again is fine, but as a huge fan of this guy, it is a bit of a shame. Speaking of which, Tokimitsu is in the exact same category for me. Perhaps the physically strongest player in Blue Lock, probably only rivaled by post-wildcard Kunigami. With incredible acceleration and stamina, he's another character that was introduced extremely strong, but has now just kind of faded into the background a bit. And don't get me wrong, carrying on the discussion from before, they can't all be top players. And if every side character got a chance to do something, it'd start to feel a bit plot armory. But I would have loved to see him go to Manshine instead. Not only would the emphasis on physical attributes suit him nicely, but Prince seems a lot more willing to help his players grow in comparison to Loki. Although, to be fair, as harsh as it sounds, if he lost his whole seeking confidence thing, he wouldn't really be a very interesting character. By the way, remember how he was third in the second selection? That means he must have gone through those doors very shortly after Rin. Evidently, he had some confidence then. Tabito Karasu, is another super cool character, and feels quite unique among Blue Lock's analyst players. Once rated by Jinpachi as the 3rd strongest player, he's transitioned to a defensive midfielder, and it didn't surprise me too much because his skill set always felt more fitting of a midfielder to me. Unlike someone like Isagi, who predicts his opponent's next moves and positions himself best in response, Karasu is more about analysing his opponent's weaknesses and crushing them personally. He's extraordinarily hard to steal the ball off of, and in the 3rd selection we saw him get past even Shidou. I don't think he suffers quite so much from what I mentioned with the previous 2 characters. Don't get me wrong, he did kind of go from being ranked 3rd to just another player, but he does at least get some cool moments. You know, obviously recently using Metavision to stop Isagi's shot.
Shidou Ryusei is the embodiment of football chaos, a player driven purely by ego, instinct, and an insatiable hunger for goals. What makes him so captivating isn't just his raw talent though, but the philosophy that fuels him. At his core, Shidou believes that every human being wants to leave their mark on the world. For him, that mark is scoring wild, illogical, and breathtaking goals. His happiness comes solely from this act, and he will do whatever he wants, however he wants to make it happen. Operating by his own internal standards, Shidou is the ultimate self-style egoist, a force of nature whose individuality is impossible to ignore. Whether he's landing a jaw-dropping bicycle kick to erupt the stadium or harassing Itoshi Sai, every moment with Shidou will have your full attention and interest. I just really love how the character embodies such a deep philosophical ideology, while still being the crazed and zesty demon we know.
Nanase is perhaps the most polite guy in Blue Lock, with Isagi commenting in their first conversation about how it almost felt weird talking to someone like that, given the attitude of the remaining players. In 251, we see him basically begging Rin to teach him, much to Rin's frustration, because Nanase is very weak in all areas. However, after a bit of training with Rin noticed that he is naturally ambidextrous, you know, the same weapon as Noah. Obviously, he is nowhere near Noah's level, and I think he's quite aware of that. Instead, he plays on the left wing, supporting Rin however he can, and he seems to be pretty decent at it, holding up the ball and slipping passes through. It looks like he played in the PXG vs Manshine game, but didn't do a lot as he was ranked last with just a 3 million offer. But following PXG vs Barker, he's actually jumped up to 24th, meaning he's actually in a pretty good shot of surviving. Kurona has hovered around the top 15 in the NEL. He's got great speed like Chigiri, I don't know if it's the hair colour that makes him faster or what, but he has a speed of 90. Not quite Chigiri's 98, but still enough for him to keep up with Isagi's Metavision moves, despite not having Metavision himself. I won't lie though, I know people really like him, but to me he kind of feels like he was just introduced for Isagi to have someone to work with. I don't feel like there's anything else too interesting about him. I do also struggle to see him really being impactful in the future. At the moment he seems to have to burn through his stamina incredibly quickly to do his role, with 276 being the second time that he's been subbed out for it. And when you compare him to other players that could fill that kind of role, like Otoya or Bachira, obviously Chigiri, I feel like he just doesn't really have a chance of making the starting lineup in the future.
Kenyu Yukimiya, aka the 1v1 Emperor, is one of Blue Lock's best strikers. His two main weapons include his dribbling ability, where he uses his acceleration and his physique to break through opponents, and secondly his gyro shot. Off the court and in his spare time, Yuki is a model. With a good face and genetics, you would think he is blessed. But just like our beautiful sakura flower wilts, he too is withering away as he suffers optic neuropathy, an incurable disease where his vision degrades and gets worse as he gets tired. And at that moment, his dream of being the world's best striker potentially could have ended here. But Yuki is a true egoist, and even though he could abandon his dream and continue to live a good life, he strives for this dream and continues to give it his all before time runs out. As for the story, he was most important when he broke from his typical pacifistic personality, as he challenged Isagi's views before the Manshine game, as he calls him out for being satisfied with an assist, and later how he shares the same mentality as Kaiser. Bastard Munich is a team created on the basis of rationality, but his best case of action is to act irrationally, as he doesn't have the time to reach the top of the world like the others, and so he goes for the risky plays. As the match ends, both parties come to realize that clashing the egos is the best way to evolve, and doing so led to him scoring, winning the game, and getting an offer from Ajax, who are willing to help him.
Iori is a really interesting character. To be honest, when his backstory was first introduced, I didn't remember who he was, but he's a really interesting look of the series into the nuance into its own philosophy. We see his parents being unsatisfied with being second in the country at their own respective sports. And like, I get it, but that's something they should be immensely proud of. At the very least, any frustrations about not being first shouldn't cause them to live vicariously through their son in such a twisted way. It all links really nicely to Snuffy's line about ensuring that you'll still love yourself even when your success inevitably fades away. The overwhelming pressure of his parents made football feel more like a chore than something he enjoyed. He really didn't know what else he would do until Karasu asked him. But after the rush of assisting Isagi to get the winning goal against Ubers, he's now decided to produce the greatest striker in the world with his passes, which I guess he got from his parents, but anyway. Jin's backstory, I won't lie, felt a little bit random to me at the time. And in the main story, we haven't really seen much of him, besides his decision to pass to Kaiser instead of Isagi. But in episode Nagi, he has a super cool skill set. He's a well-rounded player with great dribbling that can also pull off these super acrobatic passes. He also seems to have a great shot on top of that too. Although the rest of that match hasn't been shown yet, when we look at the end of season 1, he was the one chosen by Nagi's team, despite having the players that would be ranked 3rd and 4th by Jinpachi for that selection. It's pretty easy to see why Noah was going to put him into the Ubers match, but I think he's another victim of the PXG game having too many characters to allow these side characters to feel as strong as they actually are.
The biggest glazer in all of Blue Lock. Alexis Ness appears to be a polite and well-mannered teenager with a warm smile. But beneath the surface, he's actually a psycho that has the most insane soy meltdowns whenever his king, Michael Kaiser, is disrespected in any way, giving us some of the funniest panels in all of Blue Lock. Calling the relationship between these two teammates parasitic is an understatement. We witness Kaiser verbally and physically abuse Ness, but the reason Ness sticks around is due to his childhood. As a kid, Ness loved all things magic. It allowed him to express his creativity and feel otherwise unexplainable emotion. However, he was shunned by his family for not celebrating science maths. So he searched for magic elsewhere, in footy. After meeting and playing with Kaiser, Ness adopted Kaiser's dream as his own, essentially losing his own ego. Ness did this because he believed Kaiser to be the only player to see the same magic as him. But now after being abandoned by Kaiser, Ness has reached rock bottom, returning to zero. Now is the chance for Ness to evolve and regain that magic he once felt. The question is, will he be able to do it?
I honestly think Agi is heavily underrated. His height and long limbs comparable to Aryu, and pulls off some crazy moves like this heel flick pass in chapter 180, where Isagi actually comments that his soccer IQ and technique are both world class. He's been shown to have a great understanding of the game and how players grow. He was actually the one who suggested to Nagi the idea of having 2 trapping weapons, and he was completely correct in his comments to Ryo about how he was stifling Nagi's growth. Now, the response here is, why hasn't he scored yet? Chris Prince, as I'll come back to, seems way more interested in nurturing his players than winning the games, and likely told Agi to play with that in mind. Initially, he didn't seem to care, as he saw some growth in Nagi, but we see his frustration in the PXG game. I have a feeling the two have had arguments behind the scenes, and by the way, again, easily holding off 2 defenders to pass to Nagi. But I think if Japan play against England in the U20 World Cup, we're going to see what a hidden monster this guy actually is. Charles is PXG's heart, and at 15 years old, has not only grabbed a spot in their U20 team, but is also one of their star players, capable of bringing out both Rin and Shidou's potential, the latter something Jinpachi believed no one in Blue Lock could do. He also has a really fun mindset. He seems to care more about enjoying himself than actually winning, putting up passes that excite him, like the one that both Rin and Shidou could reach, just to see what would happen. He's also a bit of the menace on defense, often interrupting Munken's attacks with his metavision. Loki has a particular interest in him, and it's not hard to see the potential of someone who can outspeed everyone, paired with someone who can pinpoint their passes to the space that only Loki can reach. Aiku, Japan's U20 captain, was undoubtedly their strongest player outside of Sai. A victim of the philosophy Jinpachi opposes, he was told when he was younger he should be playing for his team instead of himself. His ambition at being the best in the world was shut down, and even as a child, he could see the way Japan's strikers were being boxed in. Their playstyles all the same, uninspired and dull. Perhaps in a similar fashion to Sai, he realised one day the damage of what his coaches had drilled into him, and saw that his dream of being the greatest striker in the world was dead. Similar to Sai, he transitioned to a different position, wanting to become the greatest defender to crush the boring strikers he despised, all the while secretly hoping that one would surpass him one day. He seems to represent this silent group of players in Japan aware of its weakness, who have prayed for the change that Jinpachi is bringing, and is also perhaps the first use of Metavision that we see in chapter 134. I expect he'll finish the NEL around 8th or 9th. Sendo was basically everything Jinpachi hates. His capped ambition that Sai called out, content to be the best in Japanese football, he also never really showcased anything that felt like a weapon to me, just being pretty average at everything, besides, a solid work ethic, I guess. He does kind of have a sense of ego, he's very prideful of his status as Japan's ace, and in the match against Blue Lock, he did raise his ambitions a bit. In 142, he declared he'd marry a Hollywood actress instead of a Japanese idol, which, okay dude, cool. I don't really remember him doing much in the NEL besides blocking Hiyori's shot and pinching the final goal of their game against Manshine, but he presumably got an assist in their game against Barker, given that he got a 17.5 million offer from that. This guy clearly doesn't compare to a lot of Blue Lock strikers, and so it only remains to be seen if and where he'll be subbed on. Tada is Isagi's old teammate that missed that shot in episode 1, and I thought I'd include him in this because of that scene in chapter 151. Despite putting on a pleasant persona at first, we soon see that resentment and jealousy bubble up, referring to Isagi's goal as just luck, and claiming that if he went to Blue Lock, he'd have done that too. And so obviously he's not completely wrong to say that there was an element of luck involved. That was just one piece of a very large puzzle, and to look at that one piece alone is to completely miss all of the other hard work. Whilst it's not really his fault for not having the soccer brain to understand why it was more than just luck, the message here is very clear. The people you may envy and chalk up their success to just luck or whatever have probably done a lot of things that you just don't. I've been very guilty of this myself in the past, and seeing it put very blatantly here made me very aware of that. Sai was obviously hyped up from the very start of the series as not only one of the best U20 players out there, but also someone who shares the same views on Japanese football as Jinpachi. Although of course he'd completely given up on the idea of reviving it until he saw the Blue Lock press conference. I'm fully expecting this guy to join Japan for the World Cup. It would be bizarre if we never saw him again, and unless we get a Champions League arc, this is the only way to really bring him back. And of course, he's been a part of the reviving Japan side of the story since the very beginning. We saw him acknowledge that he might be wrong about Japan being doomed, and interestingly, we don't know where he went afterwards. Obviously it goes without saying that he would be a huge asset to the team. Crazy dribbling, insane control over his passes, and almost certainly a user of Metavision. And we've seen just how destructive he is when paired with some of Blue Lock's heavy hitters. Kaiser is a phenomenal character with one of, if not the darkest backstory in the series. Brutally beaten as a child and told over and over again he was nothing but trash, he grew up believing himself to be worthless. His father never once used his name, giving him no sense of identity besides trash, until his singular friend in the world, his football, was about to be popped by his father. Instinctively fighting back to protect that shed of light, his identity was born within that football. And in order to protect that identity, he drags others down. If they're beneath him, then he can't be worthless. He uses malice to prove his existence. Obviously a broken, twisted mindset, which causes him to feel as though his own existence is under threat when Isagi threatens to surpass him. We see him telling himself to return to zero, and as those years of building a flimsy set of armor around his self-worth crumbles, what he wanted more than anything was just to be loved, to be valued. Obviously it's impossible to summarize this guy in 1 minute, so I'm going to make a full video on this guy in future. Don Lorenzo is a really funny guy, and I know we had Aiku, but it still felt very refreshing to get a defender hyped up after all his time with strikers. He grew up an abandoned youth who survived by deceiving adults before giving up on life, until a seemingly random act of kindness by Snuffy gave him a chance to start over. He's obviously made a phenomenal comeback from the state he was in to now being one of the best players in the world for his age. His man-marking of Kaiser was able to frustrate a player even of his caliber, and we see him showcase some solid dribbling skills with his weird, unpredictable movements. His obsession with money likely stems from his lack of it as a child. We see him memorizing everyone's offers and only being interested in the players worth more. Maybe that's what keeps him up at night and gives him those bags under his eyes. Now, I really like Chris Prince. I feel like he really values teaching and growing the team of players he's got, even more so than actually winning the matches. And his whole "what would the ideal Ryo Mikage do" is something I really like. And I know I made a whole video on this, but I think it's a really great question to ask yourself at basically any time. Right now, what would the ideal me do? Because I completely agree with him that a lot of the time when I'm really feeling down or whatever, it's because I'm not acting the way the ideal me would. And I also love what he says in chapter 170, where he talks about making sure that you understand your talent's mechanism, having faith in whatever your own skill set is and working to hone that, instead of looking at others and trying to completely shift to what they have. Sometimes that's fine, but sometimes that's just not right for you. Obviously, the perfect example is Isagi looking at Kaiser's Kaiser Impact and Metavision. If he tried to copy the Kaiser Impact, he would have progressed far slower because that's just not him. Now, Lavinio, no, don't get me wrong. He's a cool guy. I like his whole start by copying those you think are cool, then mixing new things to make it work for you. But it's gotta be said, when you look at some of the other masters, I would honestly say even Noah is probably better at teaching his team. And unless you're Isagi, that is a very low bar. It feels as though the only person who's benefited at all from learning from him is Bachira. And I can imagine everyone else's disappointment at thinking you're about to learn from one of the world's best players, just for him to say, nah, I'm not teaching you, just visualize the best and work towards that. It feels just like a naff version of what Chris Prince said, and he also just doesn't really tell them how to do it. We can see that Bachira is really struggling, losing every game and having just 2 players in the top 23. I gotta say, I don't think he's a good mentor at all.
Noah. In addition to Sai, he's probably the side character with the most hype in the entirety of Blue Lock, and rightfully so. You see, Noah is the true definition of success in the eyes of the writer. He's a character that was written with one purpose in mind, to show us a rational and a tangible way to reach the top. Because to Noah, success is not simply something that you want to achieve or something that you want to get. To Noah, success is a mindset. Success is a way of thinking. Actually, it is a way of living. Because Noah spends every waking second of every day of his life trying to better, to push, and to make himself the best there is. And he lives this with a calm and a very rational demeanor, as Noah doesn't believe in irrational mental blocks. To him, in order to reach the top and in order to be number one, you need to have a rational path towards that goal and to discard any unnecessary or any irrational thoughts. And so to me, if there is one thing that we need to learn from Blue Lock, if there is one thing that we should take from this show, is Noah's rational approach towards success.
Snuffy is probably my favourite character in the whole series, and I think my video on him is also one of my favourites that I've made. After 200 odd chapters of such intensity and insanity, of matches which feel like life and death, we get a man who says, football is a job. After Jinpachi spent so long hammering into everyone's head that they should live only for their own goals, Snuffy asked them to consider what will happen if they couldn't anymore. It's an important question because, in addition to injuries, as they saw at the end of Season 1, the world is a very big, scary place. No amount of hard work guarantees anything. Barou also found out in the 3v3, which is no coincidence, and so to see yourself as nothing more than your craft is extremely dangerous. We saw how it ended for his friend Mick. And so Blue Lock takes the player who has embodied Jinpachi's ideas since day one with the player who opposes it, and in doing so, beautifully explores where the limit on how far the ideas it puts forward should be taken. Loki is probably the fastest character we'll ever see, even able to match the speed of Kaiser's shot, which, okay, sure. According to Noah, he's the talent which threatens his throne the most. At just 17 years old, the same as the Blue Lock players, he already plays for the French national team, and will undoubtedly come back later in the series in a Japan vs France match. It's interesting how he was the only one of the World 5 to initially be polite towards Blue Lock, yet later on we see him hiding quite a calculated, arrogant personality that feels very villain-like. He's not the worst as a master, he at least pays attention to their games and tells them something they can all improve on, but he doesn't really tell them how to. It's just like, Karasu, win more duels. Okay, how though? It's not massively helpful, but obviously he's only really interested in nurturing Charles, so I suppose he's just doing the bare minimum to not feel or look like he's neglecting the rest of his team. And I suppose they're all doing fine without him, so it's all good. I decided to lump the other 4 members of the World 5 together because there's just not too much to say about them as individuals yet. But I feel like the reason Jinpachi paid so much money for them to just steamroll through Blue Lock was captured pretty well in Isagi's response. Everyone at Blue Lock is likely playing at a far higher level than they previously did. We know that's certainly the case for Isagi, but this match was a reminder that despite their progress, there's still a long way to go to the very top. Even their strongest attributes are completely outclassed by some of the professionals out there. But Isagi's reaction wasn't one of despair, but awe and excitement. Sure, he still had a long way to go, but given his previous victories over characters like Barou, who he initially saw as unbeatable, he saw that there was nothing stopping him from doing the same thing here. And that's something I've always found particularly inspiring. Furetsuta is the Japanese Football Union's chairman, and obviously there's really nothing good to say about him. You know, a money-obsessed, corrupt old man who tried to claim credit for Blue Lock's success after his failed attempt to shut it down. He's a scumbag to his very core, who clearly doesn't care for Japanese football besides how it will line his pockets. I think his presence and role behind the scenes adds an irreplaceable element to the story of Blue Lock. Personally, I think if the story was just about Japan as a whole, trying this project with no outside force opposing it, I think Blue Lock just wouldn't feel the way it does. You know, it adds that little bit more desperation to it. It makes us root for them just that little bit more. And of course, we wouldn't have one of the greatest arcs of all time in the U20 match. And seeing his defeated, desperate face at the end of it was really the cherry on top. Now, Anri is honestly nearly as mysterious as Jinpachi to me, because there's one huge question I've had ever since the start of the series. Given the extremely money-orientated nature of the Japanese Football Union and the general attitude of its members towards her, how on earth did she manage to convince them not only to let the Blue Lock project go ahead, but spend so much money on it? Evidently she knows something about Jinpachi that we just still don't, but how? How did she ever encounter this guy? Obviously it doesn't take long for the JFA to change their minds on it, but from what we've seen in Chapter 1, she had such a genuine belief in Jinpachi's ability to lead Japan to victory, claiming he will destroy and remake Japanese soccer, which hints at her own dissatisfaction with it for similar reasons to Jinpachi and Sai. It feels like her passion for it goes way beyond just being a football fan. And personally, I have a feeling we're not going to find out before the U20 tournament, but who knows. And last but certainly not least, the man himself. Blue Lock just doesn't work without this guy. And I don't think I included this in my previous video on how Blue Lock does edgy right, but I think a big part of what allows Blue Lock to discuss the ideas it does and have it work so well is that it doesn't originate from one of the players, but from a guy who just wants them to succeed at all costs. And just about every single player there has taken what he says on board and seen the benefits of it. We never see anyone question the things he says when he tells them how to improve. Even someone like Shidou, after Jinpachi gave an electric shock and imprisoned him, referred to his spatial awareness as his weapon, the exact same terminology that Jinpachi introduced to them. Obviously he used to be a rival of Noah's, and it's likely an injury or illness stopped him, but there's still the massive mystery of just what he did for Anri to put so much faith in him, and I'm eagerly waiting to find out. He is a legendary character and the reason Blue Lock is such a uniquely fantastic series. Oh wait, there's one more. How could I forget? Finally, the most important character in the series. More so than Jinpachi or Isagi, the one who, without Blue Lock, just wouldn't even be worth reading, let's be honest. Bachira's mum. Yeah, if you look like this, hit me up.